we're going to hop in on that and cover that residential purchase agreement. I'm just going to do a brief overview of it and then answer questions that you might have. My intention is to kind of just touch on the grid, and then we can talk about any questions that you might have regarding the commissions or whatever it might be. So I do have it up on my screen. Again, the residential purchase agreement has several forms attached to it. The first one is the disclosure regarding agency relationships, which just talks about the way that somebody can be represented in a real estate transaction. Okay, not super complicated there. Also covers the seller and buyer responsibilities. The second page of that is just all the legal jargon. It's actually probably the only page that I haven't read in its entirety, is that page. All right. Then we used to, remember, they used to stack on like 20 different forms at the beginning of the residential purchase agreement, and then you'd finally get to the purchase agreement. Now they've moved all of those forms to the end of it. They're still there. Don't worry. Don't fret. They haven't taken them away. They've just put them at the end. So we just have the agency disclosure first, and then we have the California residential purchase agreement. Now, keep in mind that with my purchase agreements, I like to include the market conditions advisory, the MCA form, and the SBSA, which is the statewide buyer and seller advisory. I also usually include the WFDA, the wildfire disaster advisory, because then it kind of is all encompassing. Everything's been covered up front. The market conditions advisory says that, hey, buyer, you're like responsible for the price that you decide to offer on a property. And so I think it's pretty important to have that before they actually make the offer. So I include it with the purchase. And then the statewide buyer and seller advisory talks about, that's the MCA that I usually include with this. And then I usually include the SBSA, which is a statewide buyer and seller advisory, which is like 14 pages of all the different types of inspections or investigation a buyer can do on a property. Again, it also outlines everybody's duties in the transaction. So I like that one up front as well. The wildfire disaster advisory just advises people that, hey, we're in an area where there could be wildfires. Make sure you check the cost of insurance ahead of time, and make sure it's insurable. Make sure you know what the dangers are of this area. So those are kind of like my main ones that I include with that purchase agreement. Hopping into the purchase agreement, the first page, you're going to put the date prepared up here. If you just click on it, it puts in today's date. So keep that in mind. You don't got to like type it in or select it. We just click on it and there you are. You're going to put in your buyer's names here. Now, keep in mind, it's really important when we put in our buyer's names that we double check what the lender has on the pre-approval letter. Oftentimes, the names the buyers have given us are not their full legal name, and we actually need their legal name on the purchase agreement. So just make sure it matches that pre-approval letter. Sometimes the pre-approval letter will have like their middle initial or their middle name on there. Double check with the lender as to if you have to include that or not, or if the buyer would like it included. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Okay, but make sure their legal name goes there. The property to be acquired, there is a trick to this. Okay, you can type it in, or before you open up the forms into the editor, there's a little button on your car forms library that says MLS Connect. You put in your user ID and password, you put in the MLS number, you hit find, and it will actually pull all this data into the contract for you. So it will pull the address. This is the street. Goes there. The city goes here, right? The county goes here. The zip code goes here. I'm not putting it in there because we get in trouble if I put even a fake address in here. The parcel number goes here. So the parcel number you can find in the MLS. Okay, if you've done the MLS Connect, it will automatically, generally speaking, pull it over for you. If the property isn't listed in the MLS and you're typing everything in, then the assessor's parcel number, you can search the county tax records to get that parcel number. Oftentimes you can find it like on Zillow. Sorry, but usually they have the parcel number on all the properties. Or you can ask the title company to get you the parcel number. Or if you have like a title portal that allows you to search properties, you can pull it in there. So make sure you put that parcel number on there. That actually is the legal description for the property, is that parcel number. That's what the county looks at to differentiate it from every other property out there in the world. is this APN number, not necessarily the street address. When you put the street address on here, please make sure you put the suffix. Okay, so that would be like street, drive, court, road, right? Put that on there because oftentimes in the same city, there are the same addresses. One is on a drive, one is on a court, one's on a circle. So make sure you put the complete street address on there, number, street, and the suffix for that street. All right, so any questions on section 1? It's pretty self-explanatory, but there's a lot of little details in there. I do have the chat box open as well. So if you don't want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to throw it in the chat box. I am keeping an eye on that. Section 2 is our agency information. This is how we're being represented in the transaction or how the clients are being represented. For the most part, you're going to have the seller box change. This is where the seller's brokerage firm goes. And please make sure to put the seller's brokerage here. It will help your offer to get accepted. I promise. Listing agents don't like to have to go back and fill stuff out. So between you and another offer, they might be like, oh, I've got to do too much work to get that one accepted. Also put in their license number here. If you did MLS Connect, it usually will pull over this information for you and you don't have to do it yourself. Here's where you're going to put in the seller's agent's name there and their license number here. Now keep in mind, just like we do with Realty One Group Fox and Amy Petard, there are 2 separate license numbers, one for the brokerage, one for the agent. That is the same case for most agents. Now keep in mind that if it is a small brokerage or it is the broker of the firm, they may have the same number on there, so that's okay. So usually you can find the license number. You go into the MLS. You can actually go into search. You can go agent search. Well, number one, if the property's in the MLS Connect pulls it over. If not, you can find it on the listing. It has all that information there. If the property's not listed on the MLS, it's an off market, you're trying to put in, there's another agent that offered the property to you. You can go into the MLS and do search, and you can search for the agent. So not only can you do property searches in the MLS, but you can do agent searches. You can also go to the DRE's website at dre.ca.gov, I believe is the website. Don't hold me to that one. You can search agents information there. You can search by name. It'll pull it up and give you those license numbers as well. The next line is where you're going to put the buyer's brokerage firm. That's going to be you and your name along with the appropriate license numbers. Now, for the most part, we're going to check, hey, the seller's brokerage firm represents the seller. The buyer's brokerage firm represents the buyer. Now, the only time we go, hey, it represents both the buyer and the seller as dual agencies is if we are writing an offer on any property listed by any other agent at Realty One Group Fox. So any other agent that represents the seller in our office, right? Whatever office you belong to, in our office, it's going to be dual agency because this contract is actually with the brokerage. You are an agent for the brokerage, but the contract is with the brokerage. Okay. So if there's 2 agents representing the buyer and the seller from the same brokerage, that is dual agency. And you check the box for both the buyer and the seller, dual agent. Okay. Same thing if you're representing both the buyer and the seller in the transaction, same thing there. Keep in mind too that I highly don't recommend that you represent both the buyer and the seller in the transaction. That's usually where most problems arise because the transaction that we're doing for a seller is completely opposite as the transaction that we're doing for the buyer. And I think it's really difficult to not live in the gray area when representing both parties. And it's hard to keep the interests separated and your client's best interest at heart. So if I had a listing, somebody called me off a sign, they wanted to write an offer, I'm going to refer that buyer to somebody else in my office so that I still get a referral fee off that, but they're going to do the offer and the negotiation and everything, assuming that the offer gets accepted on that property. If the offer doesn't get accepted on that property, then what happens is I'm going to take that buyer back into my buyer pool and finish representing them for whatever other house they buy that I'm not representing the sellers on. If there's more than one brokerage representing the seller or the buyer, Then you would check this box here on C, car form ABA, additional broker acknowledgement. You're like, Amy, what does that mean? Let's say that there was a divorce. And generally we don't see this with buyers. We see it more with sellers, and we don't see it that often. But let's say there's a divorce, sellers are getting divorced, husband wants to hire this agent, wife wants to hire this agent, and to protect both interest in the party or interest in the transaction, to make sure they're both represented, the agents decide to work together on that transaction. That might be where you would check the box for more than one brokerage represents the seller, and then there would be car form ABA there. So that's where that comes into play. That's how that works. Two brokerages representing the same person. D is potentially competing buyers and sellers. They acknowledge they've received a copy of the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. That's at the bottom of the residential purchase agreement. It's one of the attached forms. Any questions about section 2, agency? All right, section 3 is our terms of purchase and allocation of costs. And just so you guys know, you don't have to wait for me to ask. If you have questions, you can feel free to just unmute yourself and interrupt me. You can raise your little Zoomy hand, or you can throw it in that chat box. Section 3 is our grid. Okay, this is where all the terms of the transaction are going to get spelled out. Keep in mind that if I'm looking at the purchase price, this isn't just A, it's 3A. So if we're going to reference it on a counter offer, an addendum, or something like that, an amendment, you're going to reference 3A here. This first column is the section of the contract. So 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D1. This second column here is where you can find more information about that item. So if I'm looking for more information about the purchase price, I would go down to paragraph 5 or 5B. So if I scroll down here past the grid to section 5, additional terms affecting purchase price, right? And then 5B is the all cash offer. So this is where it talks about that purchase price information. There's not much in there for purchase price. Okay, so that's how this grid works. A is the reference for the section. Paragraph numbers where we can get more information is in the second column. The paragraph title or contract term is here in the third column. And then the fourth and fifth column are generally where we fill in information. So here's where you would plug in the purchase price. This is the total price, that your buyers want to offer for the property. Okay, goes there. If it's going to be an all cash offer, we would check this box here for all cash. If it's not going to be all cash, we don't check that box. And I get this question all the time. If it's a hard money loan, is it a cash offer? No, it is not cash offer. Catherine, yes, I see that you have to hop off. No problem. They are recorded. It gets posted to my YouTube channel, and then there's also a link. So I'll make sure that Abby gets your information and get you over a link for that YouTube channel so you can see when it gets posted online. All right, sorry. No problem. All cash. So if it's going to be all cash, if it's hard money, if the buyer does not have proof of funds, of those funds being in one of their accounts, it is not a cash deal. Okay. Hard money is still financed. We might not do an appraisal contingency. We might not do a loan contingency, but it still needs to be financed because the lender still has the funds in the lender's account. So there's no way for us to show proof of funds. So if it's all cash, just keep in mind that we need to be able to show an account with those funds in it. Okay. All right. Close the escrow here. We have two options. We've got a 21. We've got days after acceptance is the first, right? That's where you put in like 21 or 30 or 45 or 62, right? Whatever days after acceptance. That means if the offer gets accepted today, this is day 0, tomorrow's day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So that shows you how many days after acceptance the close of escrow is scheduled to be, or we can do a specific date. Okay, maybe the buyers are getting an inheritance on November 30th, and so we want to close on December 2nd to make sure those funds are in their account and that we can wire them to title and escrow. So we're going to put a specific day in there. Maybe we want it 30 days. So there's lots of different ways to work it. Maybe their lease expires on a specific day. Who knows? There could be 100 different reasons why you would choose either option, but you do have those there, but it is an or. So you have to pick one or the other. You can't do both. Expiration of the offer is 3C, 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures. Okay, so notice it doesn't say like 3 calendar days after electronic delivery of the offer. It's after buyer signatures. So if buyer 1 signs it today, buyer 2 doesn't sign it till tomorrow, and then I didn't realize they actually signed it, and I don't send it to the other agent until Friday, it's 3 days from tomorrow, because that's when the second buyer, the last buyer, signed it. Okay, so that's the default. So just kind of keep that in mind. And it's calendar days, not weekdays or business days. So every day counts. And it expires at 5 p.m. Now you can change that. Like I just submitted an offer the other day, and it was Monday night, and I submitted it with a deadline of the next day. So today's the 6th, we'll say the 7th at 6 p.m. You can change the day or the time or both. So I could leave it at 3 days after all buyer signatures, but I might change it instead of like 5 p.m. I want an answer by 1 p.m. on that day, or maybe I want an answer by 10 a.m., right? So that's 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures at 10 a.m. Or I could pick a specific date. So there's lots of different ways you can work that box as well. So that's that. D1 is the initial deposit amount. Here's where you're going to put in what the deposit is. Generally speaking, in the Solano County area, it's generally approximately 1% of the purchase price is what's customary and considered regular. In the Bay Area, just so you know, it's usually closer to like 3%, right? So make sure you know where you're submitting the offer and what's customary in that area, and also what your buyer is comfortable with. This is one of those areas that it could make your offer look stronger or weaker depending on what you put there. And keep in mind that it doesn't give you any benefit to go over 3%, because if our buyers end up choosing to initial the liquidated damage clause, it limits the seller to 3% of the deposit, whichever's less. Okay. It says over here, so additional terms, right? So we put in the terms and conditions. Now we've got additional terms. It's saying that, hey, we're going to get that deposit into escrow, because that's where we send our deposits. We don't handle the buyer's money. Please don't take deposits from your buyers. If you do take money from your buyers, you must log it in our trust account, which means you need to contact the office and let them know that you've received a check or cash or whatever it is from your buyer, and that you will be dropping it off at the office, or that you will be dropping it off at the title company. Anytime that money touches your hands, even if you're going straight from the buyer to the title company, you have to log it in our trust account. So just be aware of that. It's safer to just not touch their money. Okay, but it says that, hey, we're going to get that deposit to escrow within 3 business days after acceptance by wire transfer. So the default is 3 business days after acceptance by wire transfer. I personally like to come in here and check this box here, and I like to put buyer to choose method, which means that, hey, my buyer can use the electronic check system. They can drop off a check. They can wire those funds. If we left it at wire, my buyers took a check to the escrow company. Now I have to do an AEA, an amendment to the existing agreement, to change that term from wire transfer to check. Okay, so I just like to say, hey, buyer to choose method, usually within 3. This is the only thing in the contract that is business days. Okay, the deposit is business days because title and escrow is not open on the weekends. So if I get an offer accepted today, it is Wednesday. Today is day 0. Thursday is day 1. Friday is day 2. This is business day. So my 3rd business day is going to be Monday. So the deposit is due, if my offer was accepted today, the deposit's due by Monday at the end of the day. Okay, so that's how that works. Business days only. Okay, D2 is the increased deposit. So this is going to be money placed in escrow after the initial deposit. We're going to use form DID at time increased deposit is made. So oftentimes we can use this as a matter of negotiation. So we're going to say, hey, we're coming in with 1%, but after 5 days, we're going to do an increased deposit of another $7,000 for another 1%. And it's going to say the default is upon removal of all contingencies. Okay. Or we could say a specific date here. So it might be like, hey, we're going to do it on this date. Or we could go here and say in 10 or 5 days after acceptance. Okay, so you've got lots of options there. The default for increased deposit is at the removal of all the contingencies. That's all 8 or 9 contingencies that we have in place. Or we could pick a specific date, or we could fill in whatever we wanted to do here. Okay, lots of options there. Maybe your buyer's like, man, I don't have any money in my account right now. Like I can do a $500 deposit, but like in 5 days, I can increase the deposit by another 6,500 to make it that full 1%. It's just going to take me a minute to get those funds transferred into an account that I can write a check from. So we might need to fill that in there. Okay, there's lots of different options that you can utilize using that increased deposit. Any questions about the top A through section 3A through D?
Amy, I do have a quick question.
Yes.
So, when we receive an offer, so let's say we're on the listing side, right? We get an offer that has
Yeah.
like the 3-day, whatever, it just defaults. But you receive the offer, let's say 8:30 at night. You don't check
Yeah.
your email. Does that still count as day one or
It
zero?
still counts. Yeah, because actually the deadline for the offer is the 3 days after the last buyer's signature. So it actually has nothing to do with when you even receive it on that one. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes. But I guess no, I take that back. So I'm talking about like going into contract, like an executed contract.
Okay, executed contract for if let's say that you're the seller and you're like, man, I got an offer, or even you're the buyer and the seller signs the offer that they're accepting it and they send it back to you.
Yes.
That would be electronic receipt, which I feel like they changed recently. So let me just double check. Hold on, because it used to be as long as they could prove that they sent it to you, that was when the time period started. And that's when right, because there used to be a game that we played before they updated the contract, which was if we don't check our email and don't respond to text message because they sent us an accepted offer at 11:30 at night, then it doesn't count as day 0 because we didn't acknowledge that we received it. If we didn't check it, we didn't receive it, right? And then they changed that for a short period of time, and it may still be changed. So I just want to double check on it. They changed it to as long as I could prove as the listing agent that I sent the accepted offer back to you at 11:30 at night, that is day 0. So let's just double check. I'm just going to come down here to the signature line. It could be in the repeat. No. All right. Hold on. Somewhere it outlines it. If parties, let's see here, more than one party.
I think I saw like the delivery section.
Okay, let's look at the delivery section. I'm also going to add that form in. Time is of the essence. Oh, okay. Okay. Delivered, or delivery of documents unless otherwise agreed means and shall be effective upon personal receipt of the document by the buyer, seller, or their authorized agent. Personal receipt means a copy of the document or is applicable link to the document is in possession of the party or authorized agent, regardless of the delivery method used, for example, email, text, or other. A document or as applicable link to the document shall be deemed to be in possession if it is located in the inbox for the applicable party or authorized agent, or an electronic copy of the document or as applicable link to the document has been sent to the designated electronic delivery address specified in the broker section. So as soon as I can prove that I've sent it to you, that is when the timeline starts.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's a good question. Thank you for asking that question. So as soon as I send it off as the listing agent, or the listing agent sends it to me, even if I haven't actually opened my email up yet, that is day 0. All right. Back up to our grid. Any other questions there on that top section with the purchase price, deposit? All right. If we check the box up here for all cash, this next section, it takes away all of our options of filling anything in because there are no loans. We uncheck that. That's when we get section E1 and E2, where we can fill it out. So loan amount, I get a lot of agents that get mind boggled on this section here, which is fine. It's a little confusing. So we're going to talk with the lender. We're going to find out what the down payment is that the buyers are putting down. So if they're putting 3.5% down, it's an FHA. I would take my 700,000 purchase price, and I'm going to, you can do it one of 2 ways. Okay, if they're putting 3.5% down, 100 minus 3.5% means that they are financing 96.5%. So on your handy dandy calculator that you have on your phone, you take 700,000 times 96.5%, okay, which gives us the loan amount of $675,500. Now, the other way to do it on your handy dandy phone is 700,000 minus 3.5% equals, you're going to get the same answer. Okay, but we want the full loan amount there. I get people confused on this because they're like, well, the buyer said they're coming in with a down payment of this, but then we have the deposit, and how does that factor in? Just ignore the deposit. It's not going to matter. So in this case, it would be, and if you want to double check your math right here, look, it tells us, it automatically calculates out for us the percent of the purchase price based on the loan amount that we fill in. Okay. So again, you can either do the total purchase price times the amount that they're going to finance. So it'd be 100% minus whatever their down payment is, or we're going to go full purchase price minus 3.5% equal. That will also give us the same number. Okay, now the difference is, let's say the purchase is 700,000 and they're like, we're coming in with 80,000. Well, that makes it easy. Now we're just going to say, hey, it's 620,000. We're just going to take the purchase price minus the amount of down payment. Okay, again, the initial deposit factors nothing into this loan amount or their down payment. The deposit's going to count towards their down payment and closing costs, but it's not going to affect the loan amount. So it's not like, oh, I've got to take, they said they're coming in with an $80,000 down payment, plus they're doing a $7,000 deposit. I've got to add those two now to 87. No, that gets too complicated. So just whatever they say they're putting down, subtract it from the purchase price. That's your loan amount. Okay. We're going to go back to 675,500, 96.5. We are going to, it defaults on the next line to a fixed rate. So it's important to have a conversation with the lender to make sure you know whether they've got a fixed rate loan or an adjustable rate loan. If they have an adjustable rate loan, we're going to check this box here. If not, we're just going to leave it alone for fixed rate. It defaults to fixed rate. I highly recommend that we put in an interest rate here. So I'm going to contact the lender and say, hey, what's the interest rate that you think the buyers are going to get? And they're going to be like, oh, it's 6.5%. Be like, great. I'm going to bump it just a little bit and put 6.75%. You're like, Amy, why would you put an interest rate there? Because this gives us grounds that if we have a loan contingency in place and interest rates jump through the roof tomorrow before we're able to lock it in, and now they're at 7.75%, and the buyer still qualifies for that loan. Based on the interest rate alone, we can cancel the contract because it's higher than what the buyers are comfortable paying on a monthly basis, even if they still qualify for the loan. So that's why it's important to put an interest rate there. I usually don't put it right at the interest rate that is on their pre-approval letter that the lender is pretty sure they'll get, because I want a little bit of wiggle room there, but I'm also not going to put it really high either. Okay, so that's why it's important to put an interest rate there so that the buyers have grounds. If the payment gets uncomfortable, they can cancel. The next line is buyer to pay points to obtain the rate above. So when rates started jumping through the roof back like 2 years ago, it was really common for them to, there was some shell shock there of what the rates were. And we were doing a lot of buy down. So here it was, hey, the buyers are comfortable at 6.75, and it shouldn't cost them more than 1 point to obtain that rate above. I don't think it'll let you put in 0. Oh, it will. If the buyers are just doing regular financing, please put in 0 there, because we're just further clarifying our stance that here's the interest rate my buyers are comfortable with. They're not paying any points to get there. Okay. If they're going to pay points, then you're going to put whatever it's going to take to get them to that interest rate that they were comfortable with and what they were willing to do. Okay. Any questions about that loan section? There's a lot in that little 4 lines of text. Okay. Over here on the additional items, additional terms, we have that it defaults to conventional financing, or if checked, it's the other one. So if it's going to be FHA, so usually 96.5%, it's going to be an FHA loan. Then we're going to include the FVAC and the HID form. That's the FHA value. I don't even remember. But it's the appraisal contingency one. And then the HID is for your protection, get a home inspection. If it's VA, then it's just going to automatically attach the FVAC, not the HID. I would say include that HID for your protection, get a home inspection with all of my offers, because I want all of my buyers to get that home inspection. If it's going to be seller financing, we don't see that very often. Sometimes with vacant lots, we actually see it quite a bit up in North Idaho. Seller financing comes into play often. Then we would check that box, or we would check other. Like if it was a hard money loan, you would check other and put hard money loan. Okay, so that's how you fill out that additional terms. If we don't check anything, it's conventional financing. If we're going to go FHA or VA, then we come down here to this last line item on section E1. I'm surprised this isn't like E2 or something, and then they renumber everything. At some point, it probably will be. If FHA or VA checked, deliver a list of lender required repairs. The default is 17 days after acceptance. Okay, I like to have this match whatever my investigation or the appraisal contingency is. Generally speaking, it's going to be the appraisal contingency because it's the appraiser that points out lender required repairs. Okay, so I usually have this match my appraisal contingency, whatever that is. If it's just conventional, we just leave it blank. Don't fill it in if it's conventional. Okay. E2 is additional financed amount. So if they're going to do a first loan and a second loan, this is where we use E2, additional financed amount. So let's say that they were going to finance 600,000 of it on a first loan, and then 5% of it on a second loan. Then that's where we use this. It's going to default to a fixed rate. Again, we're going to fill this out just like we would fill out for first financing, whether it's a fixed or adjustable rate. Oftentimes secondary financing, a lot of times they're HELOCs, sometimes they're fixed, but oftentimes they're adjustable. Just ask the lender. They will tell you this information, and ask them what the interest rate is. Oftentimes interest on a second loan is much higher than your interest on your first loan. Why do buyers do a first and a second? There could be lots of reasons. We could be doing seller financing for a second, gives us that option over here. We could be breaking up, if we go over 80% financed, then we have to add that mortgage insurance premium to the loan. And if we break it up on conventional financing with, like, we're putting 10% down, we do an 80% first and a 10% second, then oftentimes we don't need that mortgage insurance. It allows the buyers to pay off that second loan faster and get rid of that payment. And oftentimes that payment might be less than what the cost of the mortgage insurance would have been. So there's a lot of different reasons why somebody might do different options with first and second financing. And again, if they're not going to pay any points, put a 0 there. We are going to default to conventional financing, or if checked, seller financing or other. Now, other financing could be things like a Cal HOFA loan where we're doing down payment assistance or closing cost assistance or any of those grants. We want to make sure we put that on the contract, because if something happens and the buyer doesn't qualify for that secondary down payment assistance as we're going through underwriting, we want the ability to be able to cancel based on their not qualifying for that secondary financing option. Okay, so this is what allows us to be able to cancel under the loan contingency based on what we fill out here and what the type of financing is. Okay, any questions there on E1 or E2? I know this first page is like a meaty section. Thank you, Bree, for the thumbs up. E3 is occupancy type. It defaults to primary residence. If checked, it would be secondary or investment. Why is that important? Because it's under the E, which is all part of the loan section. That would matter to the lender of how they're doing financing. So if they're doing the financing as an investment property, we want to make sure to check that box. Or if we're doing it as like a secondary property, that would be like a vacation home, we want to check that box. They all trigger different interest rates and different types of loans and different things like that. All right, the balance of the down payment. So this is where people get tripped up, right? They're like, hey, okay, so the purchase price was $700,000. My loan amount was $675,500. It showed that my loan amount was 96.5%. There's no additional financing. But my buyer should be coming in with like $24,000 and it's only showing $17,000. So that's not right. So now I need to come up here and adjust this loan amount. No, don't do that. This is where that deposit comes back into play. So what this contract has already done is it's taken the difference between the purchase price and the loan amount, and then also subtracted any deposits that we have. Okay, that's how we got $17,500. It took purchase price minus loan amount minus deposit. Okay, total purchase price $700,000 is down here on the bottom. So dun, da, 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 we made it, and it calculates those for you just to make sure you can check your math and you're doing it right. I wouldn't pay that close of attention to the balance of purchase price because, again, it's subtracting the deposit out of that number. Okay, that brings us to the end of page 1 of the grid, which takes us over to page 2 of the grid. Starting with section G, it's asking on 3G1, do we want any seller credit? Okay, this isn't necessarily where we want to negotiate under the SPBB or the coverage of the commission that our buyers have agreed to pay on our BRBC if the buyers want to ask the sellers to cover that on their behalf. This is just, hey, closing costs. What kind of closing costs do we want the buyer to cover or the seller to cover? Okay, we would check this box here if we want it. Maybe they need a $10,000 closing cost credit. We're going to put that in there. Seller credit to be applied to closing costs or other. If we wanted, like, maybe we wanted the seller to install a new roof, but we wanted a credit for that was going to be held in escrow, then we could do that, right? So this would be other new roof. Okay. The only reason we would want to put that in there is if we, generally speaking, it's going to be closing costs. Anything that goes on that closing statement is going to be a credit to the buyer. Even if we aren't negotiating commissions separately and that's part of their closing costs, we can negotiate it all as one number there as a seller credit. We can just leave it as closing costs. Those are all part of the costs to close the transaction for the buyer. If we wanted something like a new roof, The only reason we would put it in there as a repair item is if the lender is aware that we're going to do that and they're okay holding those funds in a escrow account after the close of escrow. Okay, so if I said, hey, we want $10,000 for a new roof, what's going to happen is this is going to trigger the lender to go, okay, is there a roof report? Is there a quote for the new roof? We need to see all this so that we can make sure there's enough funds there, and we can't close escrow until we have those funds held in escrow. We know they're going to hold them to actually pay for the roof repairs. And the buyers have to get those roof repairs done within X number of days or months after the close of escrow. Show proof to the lender. It becomes this whole thing. Any repairs that get delayed after the close of escrow, but you can do, it's called an escrow holdback. They do them. We don't see them very often. I have negotiated them. They're kind of a mess. It's better to get the repairs done ahead of time, or to just not say anything about the roof and just say, hey, we want it for our closing costs. Okay, so that's the best way to do it. Keep in mind the buyer can't get a bigger credit here than what their actual closing costs are. So it's important that we know what their actual closing costs are going to be, because we don't want to negotiate a $20,000 credit and then have their closing costs only be 14,000, because you know what's going to happen to the difference between 14,000 and 20,000, which is 6,000. That's going to go back to the seller. Okay, so they actually only got a $14,000 credit because that was the total of their closing costs. So just kind of keep that in mind there. If the buyer wanted to replace the roof after the close of escrow, we negotiated a closing cost credit. Maybe it was going to be $10,000 to replace that roof. It's a small house. Okay. We can negotiate that as a closing cost credit. And how that works for the buyer is now they are going to get a credit from the seller of $10,000 that counts towards their closing costs, which means the buyer is going to come in with less funds in order to close escrow. So they should still have that $10,000 that they were originally going to pay for closing costs sitting in their account after the close of escrow so that they can get the roof repairs done. Okay. I'm going to warn you ahead of time, especially with like first-time home buyers. They're kind of irresponsible. They're in over their head oftentimes. They are overwhelmed by the decisions and things that have to get done. Usually it's better to try to negotiate the roof to get repaired before the close of escrow, because the buyers forget to do that. And then they realize, oh, we've got more money in our account. Let's go get new appliances and a new couch and a new car. And then all of a sudden that money's gone and the roof is now leaking. And they're like, hey, what happened to that $10,000 for the roof? And you're like, it was still in your account. You were supposed to have it done. So it's better to have big repairs like that done, or the escrow holdback, because buyers are irresponsible. That's my personal opinion. But I'm just throwing that out there. So anyways, seller credit gets negotiated there. For the most part, it's always going to be closing costs. So you don't have to ever fill in anything on additional terms. Additional financing terms are G2. These are any other terms. Maybe they've got like 3 loans. So maybe they have a first loan, FHA, and then they've got a down payment assistance. And then they also have a secondary or third financing for closing cost assistance. You can put third loan, closing cost assistance, whatever that loan is called, there on the additional terms. That way we make sure again that it's covered. So in the case they don't qualify for one of these loans that we're stacking together, that they're covered in that they can cancel under that loan contingency, because we stated all the terms of which the financing was based on. Okay. G3 is seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement, car form SPBB attached. So that would be if we're trying to negotiate on behalf of our buyer for the commission to be covered by the seller, we use form SPBB. There's been a lot of success with these. Most sellers are still looking at covering the commission. So oftentimes we're able to negotiate that on behalf of the buyer. H1 is verification of all cash. So this is if it's an all cash offer, it's H1 applies. If it's a financed offer, H2 applies. I kind of wish it was a little more clear on there. So this is a financed offer. We don't actually care what's on H1. We just skip down to H2, verification of down payment and closing costs. Now keep in mind, if I was doing 3.5% down, which was like $24,500. I'm also going to have closing costs, which are about 2.5% generally of the purchase price. So that's another $14,000. So when I want to do the verification of down payment and closing costs, I'm looking for 24,500 plus about 14,000, so about $38,500 in an account to show proof of verification of down payment and closing costs. Okay, the default is that this is going to be attached to the offer. Same with if it's an all cash offer, it defaults to attach. Or if you're going to give it over within, 1 day after acceptance or whatever, we would change that there. So oftentimes we want to submit that with the offer, whether it's cash or down payment. So H1 is for all cash, no financing. And H2 is going to be verification of down payment and closing costs if the deal's financed. Verification of loan application is H3. That's going to be attached to the offer. So that's that pre-approval letter that we get from the lender. Again, this doesn't apply if it's all cash. The default's attached to the offer, or we can change it to days after acceptance. Default's 3. Pre-qualified, pre-approved, or fully underwritten pre-approval. Pre-qualified is, hey, I told the bank what I made and what I have in my accounts and what my credit score was, and they issued me this letter. We usually get those from mega banks. Pre-approval is they've actually pulled credit, reviewed income and asset documentation, and they're pre-approved, and they're pretty certain that they are going to qualify for that loan. Fully underwritten is when it's actually been submitted to an underwriter for review. We know what those conditions are going to be. So those are kind of your 3 step-ups. For the most part, most of our letters are pre-approvals. Any questions on G or H before I move into I? All right. I is blank. J is verification of property condition. If we leave it at the default, you're going to do that final walkthrough on the 5th day prior to the close of escrow. Okay, it happens 5 days prior to close of escrow. I like to update it to 1 to 5 days, which says anytime during that window, I can go do that verification of property condition. We're verifying during that final walkthrough that the property is in the same condition as it was when we put in the offer, and any repairs that were negotiated have been completed. Our assignment request, which is K, it defaults to 17 days after acceptance. Keep in mind, assignment is, there's lots of different ways this is used. Sometimes it's used by investors. They enter into contract on a property, and then they assign it to somebody else during that close of escrow period, which allows them to actually sell the contract for more than they're in contract for. And then they pocket the difference of money. So if we're in contract, maybe they got a deal at 700,000, property's really worth 800,000. They can talk to somebody else and they say, hey, I'll sell it to you for 750,000. The person who's doing the assigning, it's kind of like wholesaling, gets that $50,000 to then assign it to the new buyer. So that would be the assignment. The other way we use assignment is sometimes we get into the underwriting process and we realize that, oh my gosh, we can't have the spouse on this loan because her credit sucks. Or, sorry, that was very sexist of me to say her. Could be his. Anyways, or maybe we need to add somebody to the transaction because we need more income in order to complete the purchase, right? So lots of reasons. So assignment could be handing the whole contract to another party, or it could be adding or removing buyers. Okay, that's what assignment is. So I usually leave this at the default of 17 days. Sometimes I actually have it matched like kind of the escrow period, just so it's floating around out there at any time we can assign or add or remove buyers. Section L starts our contingency period. So L1 through 9 are all the different types of contingencies that we have in place. For the most part, most buyers have 8, some will have 9. L1 is the loan contingency. If there's no loan contingency, we check this box here. If we check this box here for no loan contingency, we don't need a separate contingency removal form. This is sufficient for removing that loan contingency. If the box is unchecked, then we can either use it the default of 17 days or fill in a number there. The appraisal contingency is 17 days is the default, or you could update it to days after acceptance on the line. If we check the box for no appraisal contingency, we don't need a separate contingency removal form for the appraisal. Now, keep in mind here, it says removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate the appraisal cancellation rights in the FVAC. So if I've got an FHA offer, I can say, hey, I've got no appraisal contingency. But then because we submitted the FVAC, which is required by an FHA loan, it actually still has an appraisal contingency in there. So we actually haven't eliminated the appraisal contingency. Something to be aware of if you're a listing agent. Okay, so there you go. There, same thing with the VA and FHA, both have the FVAC form. The appraisal contingency, back to the first line there, third column, appraisal contingency is based on appraised value at a minimum purchase price or blank. So for the most part, it's saying, hey, our contract's at 700,000, where it's based, the appraisal contingency is based on 700,000. If we wanted to do what's called like an appraisal guarantee, we could say, hey, as long as it appraises at 680,000, my buyers are good to move forward. Right? So now we're saying that, hey, the appraisal contingency is based on the appraised value coming in at least 680,000. We don't care if it gets to 700, but it's 680. Why does that matter? Because it's going to increase your down payments potentially, depending on what amount of the loan you're financing. Okay. L3 is investigation of property. 17 is the default. On all these contingencies, the 17 after acceptance is the default. So you got investigation of property, you got informational access to property, buyer's rights to access the property for informational purposes is not a contingency and does not create cancellation rights and applies even if contingencies were removed. So it defaults to 17 days, saying that, hey, my buyers have the right to access this property, even if my investigation contingency is removed. I can still come in and measure for my couch. I can still come in and make sure my boat's going to fit in the garage, but it's not a contingency. It's just the sellers have to allow me to access the property. After 17 days, the sellers no longer have to allow me to access the property if all my other contingencies have expired and have been removed. Okay, they can be like, sorry, it doesn't work for us. We're in the middle of packing. Maybe in like, you know, right before that, like 3 or 4 days before the close of escrow, you can come in. Right? So they can do that. They can prevent you from accessing the property after this time period has expired and before the final verification of property condition has started. Okay, next one is insurance. We want to make sure the property is insurable and that the amount of the monthly premium or annual premium is acceptable to the buyer. So insurance isn't just, can it be insured, but is the payment acceptable to the buyer? Review of seller documents. So that's your TDS, your SPQ, all of those things there, your NHD report. L6 is the preliminary title report that shows what encumbrances, what encroachments are on title, what's on that title report, separate contingency there. Common interest disclosure, that's going to be like your HOA properties is where that applies to. Review and leased and liened items. So if there's any leased or liened items, that all falls under L8. So that'd be like maybe solar, alarm systems, water softeners might fall under that one. So those all L3 through L8. If we want to remove any of those at time of offer, maybe the seller's provided us all the documents. So we're going to remove the seller review of seller documents. We would check this box here for CR-B attached. That's saying that, hey, we're removing a contingency, see the attached form, and then we would just reference that contingency on that form. It also says here, removal or waiver at time of offers against agent advice. Okay, there you go. And if we want to see more information on that, it's 8I, not 881. It's 8I. Okay. The last contingency that a buyer might have is L9, which is the sale of the buyer's property. So if the buyer is selling a property and the purchase is contingent on the sale of that property, they need to sell it for, in order to qualify for the loan, they need to sell that one because they need the funds from that sale to complete the purchase. They need to sell that one just because they're not comfortable having 2 houses at the same time. Then we would have this box here that we're going to include CAR form COP, contingency for sale of buyer's property. Okay, if we check that box, it automatically adds that form to our library. So if you come back and look at this form section, any box that I've checked, it's automatically added those forms in here for me to review and edit. Any questions on that contingency removal section? All right. M1 is time of possession. It defaults to, hey, as soon as we receive notice of that we're on record, buyer gets possession. We could change it to 6 p.m. On the date as specified in 3M2, which is down here, or attached TOPA form. So for the most part, hey, we're going to get notice or we're going to get keys upon notice of that we are on record. You can go, hey, we want 6 p.m. on the date specified, or we could give it a specific time over here, like 1 p.m. or 10 a.m., whatever it might be. M2, seller occupied or vacant units. So if anybody else besides the seller is residing in that house, it is tenant occupied. Okay, even if it's the seller's child is remaining in the house, but the seller does not live there, it's tenant occupied because it's occupied by anyone other than the seller. If it's seller occupied or vacant, then we go to this one if the time of possession is not once we receive notice that we're on record. Close the escrow date, or if checked below. Okay, so if we say, hey, we want 6 p.m., the default would be close the escrow date. Okay, so that would be the date specified. Or we could say, hey, after close of escrow, when do we get possession? If it's going to be 29 or fewer days, it's this first box. Or if the sellers are going to remain in possession after the close of escrow 30 or more days, it's the second box, and then we're going to fill that in. So this might be, hey, we're going to stay in there 14 days, or hey, we're going to stay in there 30 days would be the second box. Okay. The reason being is that there's two separate forms that we need. I highly recommend that we adjust the escrow dates if the sellers aren't in possession longer than 29 days after the close of escrow, because the RLAS is a lot longer form than the SIP. So 29 days or less, we get the seller in possession form. 30 days or more, we do the RLAS, and it tells you right here. And once you check one of these boxes, it's automatically going to add that form to your transaction. So that would be seller remaining in possession after the close of escrow. If it's tenant occupied or occupied by anybody except the seller, then we're wanting to include this tenant occupied property addendum. The TOPA form just talks about whether the properties can be delivered vacant or occupied, what we're going to do with any prorated rents and deposits. So that's all covered on that TOPA form. Any questions about section M? Okay, I'm not going to make it by 12 o'clock, but we'll end shortly thereafter. I'm going to finish the grid. In section N is documents, fees, and compliance. So N1 is seller delivery of documents. How many days does the seller have to get us those documents? I usually move this to 3. Keep in mind that if our contingency is 10 days and they're supposed to get them to us in 7 days, they don't give us to them until day 7. We still have 5 more days to review those documents. So that's part of this contract, is if something gets disclosed to us after, right, our contingency time period, or right before our contingency time period, we get bonus time. It's like it goes into overtime. So you get an additional 5 days if it's delivered electronically. Sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions. That defaults to 5 days after delivery. That usually comes from the title company to the seller. That's that, like, hey, we need to sign this to make sure the seller, we have all the information from the seller to make sure the title is free and clear. Time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents defaults to 3 days. I usually bump it to 1 because I want those HOA docs ordered right away, because that oftentimes will delay everything because HOAs are slow. Install smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. The default is 7 days. I usually bump that back to 2 to 3 days, because if I want it done before that appraiser goes to the property, and oftentimes as soon as we're in contract, the lender orders the appraisal, and I don't want the appraiser to have to come back to the property. Okay, so I want them to say, hey, within 2 days after acceptance, make sure all those things are there so that we don't have a delay because the appraiser has to come back. If the appraiser does have to come back because these things are not done, keep in mind the seller has to pay for that reinspection fee. Okay, evidence of represented authority 3 days after acceptance. That's if it's in a trust or owned by a corporation or whatever it is. It all needs to be provided within 3 days after acceptance. Any questions there on section M or N? M or N? Going through the alphabet. All right, there is no section O. We skip to section P, which is items included and excluded. All included items, all items specified in paragraph 9B are included, and the following if checked. So 9B, if you go in there, it talks about what's a fixture and what's not a fixture, what should be included, what isn't. And then we can check additional things. Bathroom mirrors is always defaulted to checked. And then you might want to include things like dishwasher, microwave, stove. Okay. Why are those things not automatically checked? Like all houses come with a stove, Amy. Yes, but technically, like if it's a freestanding range that like slides into the little hole in the counter, it's not actually attached to the property, and therefore it's not technically a fixture. So check the box that it comes with the property. Microwaves generally are built in. They're usually attached to the property, so those usually come. I check that box anyways. Dishwasher, again, it slides into that. It's not always attached to the property, so make sure to check that box. Anything else you want to be included, we check those boxes here. If there's something that could be potentially a gray area, like we don't know if it's really attached, like garage cabinets, you know, like floor standing garage cabinets, they might not be attached to the wall. If your buyers want those, make sure we check this little box here and put garage cabinets. Okay. If there's a shed in the backyard and the buyers want it, write it in because we don't know if it's actually attached to the cement underneath it. Right? So anything that could be gray, could be an unknown, we're not exactly sure, write it in here. On that same note, if there's something the buyers don't want, we put that under the excluded items tag. Okay, and keep in mind that just because it's listed in the MLS says, hey, the following items to be included with sale, washer, dryer, refrigerator, if we don't include those in the contract, the seller doesn't actually have to include those in the sale, even though they were mentioned in the MLS. Okay, so make sure that we check those boxes for refrigerator, washer, dryer. Do we want the wine refrigerator? Do we want the video doorbell? Do we want security camera equipment? Do we want smart home control devices, right? So all those things, check those boxes. Make sure it's in there. And anything we don't want, hit this box for excluded items and fill out those that the buyers want removed. Q is the allocation of costs. Natural hazard zone disclosure report, usually paid for by the seller. You can, and I usually check the box for the environmental report to be included with it. And usually here, you would put your preferred provider, or if you don't necessarily have a preferred provider, you can put, hey, seller to choose provider. Please don't put seller's choice. There's actually a company called seller's choice. And if you put seller's choice there and it ends up not being a seller's choice report, now you've got to do an AEA to clarify who the provider of that NHD report is going to be. Optional wildfire disclosure report. We generally only need this if you're in a high fire hazard area. There's additional requirements due to the location of the property. Otherwise, I usually leave that blank. Okay, there's the fortress wildfire disclosure are not applicable. So default would probably be not applicable. I'm glad they put that in there. If we have additional reports we want done, we fill them in on Q3. Okay, if it's a country property, there's a whole separate addendum for like the septic and well and property lines. Okay, so this would just be other reports we want the seller to pay for. If the buyer's going to pay for them, we don't need to mention them here. And keep in mind that anytime we put a report on this purchase agreement, the lender's going to see that and be like, oh, look, you asked the seller to pay for an HVAC report. We're going to need to see a copy of that report. And they're going to want any repairs done that were mentioned in that report. It could kill the deal. So just kind of keep that in mind. We don't want to put things on here we don't want the lender to not know about. Who's going to pay for smoke alarms, carbon monoxide, and water heater bracing? For most of your traditional 1 to 4 unit homes, generally speaking, the seller pays for those items. Q5 is government required point of sale inspections or reports. We don't have a whole lot of those in Solano County. Once you cross over to like the Bay Area, some of those that would be government required point of sale inspections and reports would be like a sewer lateral inspection. If we're in Yolo County and Woodland, that would be your sprinkler system inspection for your fire suppression system in the house. Davis has a pre-sale inspection report that has to be done by the city of Davis. So who's going to pay for those inspections or reports? My default is always that box is checked to seller. Now, when it comes to Q6, Government required point of sale corrective remedial actions. Hey, if there's any corrections noted in that, who's going to pay for that? I usually leave this section unchecked and we'll negotiate that based on the findings in the report, unless that report's already done. And then let's identify who should pay for those. The reason I do that is that as a listing agent, if somebody is marked seller, I will counter based on that box, because if we don't know, like maybe the sewer lateral inspection comes back with the whole sewer line is dead and broken, and it's going to cost $20,000 to replace. I've committed my seller to that without them knowing what that cost might be until that inspection is done and we get quotes. So I usually leave this blank and we negotiate it. Maybe they're going to split the cost. Maybe we're going to find another buyer who will pay the cost. Like, I don't want to commit my seller to those repairs unless I already know what they are. Q7 is the escrow fee. You're gonna either mark the box buyer, seller, or both. If we mark both, then this might be 50-50, or we're gonna say how we're gonna split it. You're gonna put in your favorite provider here that you want. Please don't ever check each to pay their own fees. There's no such thing as their own fees. Okay. There's one escrow fee for the transaction. There's no each to pay their own. Okay. In other, I think Southern California might be splits them off. I don't really know, but so you're either going to mark buyer, seller, or both. Usually we're going to mark what's customary for the area. Like Vacaville is like buyer pays title and escrow fees. Whereas up in the Sacramento area, I think buyer pays escrow and they split title, maybe buyer pays title and they split escrow. Reach out to your favorite escrow agent and they can walk you through what's customary for those areas. In fact, some of the providers actually have it on their website. You can go to like their regular website and click who pays, you plug in the city and county and the purchase price, and it'll tell you what's customary for that area. So just make sure you submit based on customary, or sometimes like if it's the seller supposed to pay, you're trying to be like super competitive, you can mark the buyer's going to pay it. Buyer's lender insurance title policy, it's always paid for by the buyer unless otherwise agreed. Oh, title insurance is here. Keep in mind that title and escrow are usually in the same company in Northern California, separate in Southern California. So oftentimes if we put in our favorite provider up here, we don't need to fill in anything down here for escrow. Okay, we do need to check a box for buyer, seller, or both. Again, if we put both, we're going to specify what that split is going to be, 50-50 split of fees or whatever. So we go both and go 50 splits. There we go. Okay. Q9 is buyer. Oh, I covered that one already. Q10 is county transfer taxes. Again, find out what's customary to the area. Q11 is city transfer taxes. For the most part, Solano County has no city transfer taxes, so I usually leave this blank. The exception is Vallejo. Vallejo does have city transfer tax. You want to know what's customary and check one of those boxes. And then Bay Area, Sacramento area, always make sure to check and make sure they know. If you don't know or don't know where to check, ask your favorite title rep. They'll be able to answer those questions for you. Q12 is your HOA fee for preparing disclosures. That's paid for by the seller. The Q13 is the HOA certification fee. That's paid for by the buyer. That's actually something that's done by the buyer's lender. The HOA transfer fees, unless otherwise agreed, seller shall pay for separate HOA move out fee and buyer shall pay for separate move in fee. Applies if separately billed or itemized with cost in transfer fee. So usually we're going to mark a box here, buyer or seller. Usually seller pays transfer fees, but not always. So just make sure you check one of those boxes if it's in an HOA. If it's not in an HOA, I don't check those boxes because I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing by checking boxes that are unnecessary. Private transfer fees defaults to the seller. That would be things like if there's a fee to transfer the solar, that goes to the seller. That'd be a private transfer fee. Or if they have a private water system and there's a transfer fee associated with it, that goes there. Additional fees or costs are Q16 and 17, just blank items in case we want to specify additional things that need to be covered in there and who's going to pay for those. Q18 is our home warranty plan chosen by buyer. Coverage to include, but is not limited to. This might be a good place to add one of those clauses in here of who you like for your home warranty. So this might be where we specify, hey, we want the First American home warranty value plus with fridge. or we want the old Republic Home Protection Plan gold, right? So whatever that plan is, who's going to pay for that? Is it buyer, seller, or both? Who is going to issue the home warranty plan? And maybe if there's maybe we want the pool coverage in there too, and pool, right? What's the cost not to exceed here? Keep in mind that if our home warranty might cap out at 600,000, it just means that, hey, if we're asking the seller to pay for it, the seller's only going to pay up to 600,000, and then anything above that is the buyer's responsibility. If the buyer doesn't want a home warranty plan, we just check this box here, and then we have nothing filled in, and it just says that, hey, we're not getting a home warranty plan. We don't want to just leave this box blank. Okay, we want to say that either somebody's paying for it or the buyer waives the home warranty plan. That doesn't mean that the buyer can't get a home warranty plan and pay for it themselves. They absolutely can at any time in the transaction. It just means it's not part of the contract. So if seller is paying for it or it's going to be split, we put it in the contract. If not, we usually leave it off. Other terms are R. So anything else that you want to be included as part of this, one of the things that I like to do here is in my clauses, the appraisal clause. If the appraisal, so even though I might have filled in, there was a $20,000 appraisal gap up on the appraisal that, hey, offer price is 700,000. We're good as long as it appraises at 680,000. I'm going to other terms down here clarify if the appraisal comes in below contract price, buyer to pay up to $20,000 over appraised value, not to exceed contract price. In fact, I've changed this. So normally what I says, if appraisal comes in below contract price, buyer and buyer and seller agree that contract price will be up to $20,000 under appraised value. Well, I'm going to have to reword that. But I usually, if appraisal comes in below contract price, buyer and seller agree that, that appraised value is, oops, I can't spell today. That's what happens after 12 o'clock. Appraised value is the contract price. I already covered that my buyer's paying a gap of up to $20,000. I don't have to say that, hey, it's not to exceed, but I want to say that, hey, buyer and seller agree that appraised value is the contract price, right? If we're not doing an appraisal gap. Okay. Just because, anyways, there's some wording that needs to go in there. I'll clean that up and get back to you guys on that. I usually have a better wording there. It's for if there's going to be a gap, just so that we get that the seller agrees that if the appraisal comes in low, that we're agreeing that that is the contract price. Okay. Anyways, there we go. That's the end of the grid. Any questions about, except that I've confused you now with R, besides R, any other questions that we have on this grid section of the purchase agreement? All right. The rest of it, if it's a tenant occupied, that box gets checked. If it's probate, manufactured home, stock co-op, if we're including addendums, a septic well property monument, propane addendum, short sale addendums, court confirmation, we check these boxes here. Buyer and seller advisories, if it's a trust or bank owned, right? We might check those boxes, short sale, probate. Then we have all the paragraphs that cover everything we've already talked about in detail. So this is where we can reference and find the information. Like we went back to find out what delivery meant and when that actually counted as day 0. So that's all in there. So that's the rest until we get to the signature pages. Oh, here, two things. One is the page 14 has the liquidated damage clause. This signature block is optional. All parties have to agree to this or not agree to this, otherwise the contract's invalid. And this is that one that just says, hey, that if the buyer's in default of the purchase agreement, they're not canceling within their rights as outlined in this contract, the seller has the right to retain the deposit or 3% of the purchase price, whichever is less. Okay. I highly recommend signatures on that because from the seller's point of view, it predetermines the amount the seller can keep. From a buyer's point of view, it limits the amount the seller can go after for it in the case of default. Mediation, everybody agrees to. The next one, section 28, also optional, is arbitration. This just says that, hey, if we're going to sue somebody, we're going to go to arbitration before we go to lawsuit. Okay, we're going to have a hearing in front of other real estate professionals that understand real estate law, understand the contracts. So that's the bonus here, that if somebody asks you a question, the way that it's always been described to me from like the legal standpoint is this just ensures that instead of going before a court hearing in front of a jury who has no idea what the contract actually means or how to interpret the contract, and we've got to prove to them how to interpret. If we go to arbitration, it goes before a panel of realtors that understand the contracts and contract law. So that's my caveat there for the arbitration versus not agreeing to it. And again, this is optional. All parties have to agree to it, or all parties don't agree to it for this contract to be valid. So if my buyer agrees, but my seller doesn't agree, the seller needs to counteroffer that this has been removed from the contract. All right, scrolling down here, then that's next page here, which is page 16, is the signature page. This is where our buyers sign. If it's an entity buyer, like it's a corporation purchasing the property, then we would check this box here. We would fill in the name of the corporation here, the name of the legally authorized signers, whether it's the president, vice president, whatever it might be. We go in there, and then the buyer sign down here. Okay, otherwise we just leave that box checked, and our buyer's names go here. They sign and date. Section 34 is the acceptance section. This is where the seller signed that either they have accepted it is the default. If they check this box, that means that there's a counter offer, either a seller counter offer or seller multiple counter offer. They can counter it and put them in backup offer position. Maybe they already accepted an offer and they want this one in backup offer. They would check this box. And if it's an entity seller, they're going to check this box for 34B, just like the buyers checked. And then they're going to fill out that information. Seller is going to sign here on D. If the offer is not accepted, it's being rejected. They're going to initial here, no counter offer is being made. This offer was not accepted by the seller on blank date. So that's the rejection of the offer. So those are your options there. Down here on the brokers section, this is where you're going to fill out all your information. You're going to fill out all the information for the listing agent here, put in their address, their city, state, zip. Again, if you're using MLS Connect, this all pulls over. If there's more than one agent representing the buyer, we would check that box here. Maybe it's you and a co-agent or like a team, and we include the additional agent acknowledgement, just saying that, hey, either agent can work on behalf of this buyer. Their signature is as good as the other. If there's more than one brokerage representing the buyer, so that would be, that instance where we talked about two different brokerages representing one of the parties, we would check that box there for the ABA. The default here is the designated electronic delivery address is this email right here. That means if they send it to any other email, it does not count as delivered until they send it to this one. So make sure you use something specific there that you check on a regular basis. That is the end of that. Well, then the escrow holder, that gets filled out once you're in contract. We just send this over to the escrow company and they fill that box in. So we leave this box blank. Okay. Any questions on those last couple pages? All right, fabulous. The other forms that are attached are the buyer's investigation advisory, advising our buyers that they need to Investigate the property. The brokers do not have expertise in all areas, that it's up to them to make sure that the property meets what they're looking for, and gives them all the different things that they can do, not as in-depth as the statewide buyer and seller advisory, but it gives us up to L, which is like 13 different items. The next form is your possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure or consent. Just saying that, hey, at any time I might be working with multiple buyers or multiple sellers, that I'm not going to disclose the information of your offer to my other buyers. I'm not going to prevent somebody from writing an offer on the same house. I'm not going to not show a house because you're interested in it. And that offers aren't necessarily confidential, that the seller or listing agent may share the details of their offer with other potential interested parties. The Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory just states that, hey, we are California state realtors, and we adhere to all of our national and local discrimination laws, and that we aren't allowed to discriminate on any of the protected classes. If you have any problems or think that you're being discriminated against, it gives you your fair housing resources there. Limited exceptions to fair housing is at section 12. Buyers, homeowners insurance advisory, just advising them that it's important to investigate insurance, that they get pricing, make sure the house is insurable. Wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory, don't transfer any funds unless you've confirmed the wire information directly with the source in which you're sending it to. Please don't. California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, disclosure, and notice. Just basically stating as agents, we don't have control over what gets disseminated to the internet. We can't guarantee that once you close on a property, the pictures aren't going to be on the internet still, the inside of that property, that there's certain things that do get transferred to the public, like sales price, agent involvement, concessions, those type of things is here on that Consumer Privacy Act advisory. And that's the end of the purchase agreement. Any questions before we wrap up today? Thanks for hanging in there with me. I know I went over on time. I apologize for that.
Amy, could we possibly get like a list of those clauses that you have just to like review like the wording and stuff?
I will work on clause list.
Great. And then for the disclosures, like earlier you mentioned, like you like to include the MCA and like the HID. Just so would you like include that in the same packet, or would you just send that separately?
I send it in the same package.
Got it.
So I include the MCA, the SBSA, the WDFA, which is the Wildfire Disaster Advisory, and the home inspection, for your protection, get a home inspection, the HID, all with the offer when it gets signed by the buyer.
Okay. And so like I noticed like the HID, for example, like isn't so you check it when you check like FHA and VA, or do you add it in like that little list that they have there?
I wouldn't even include it in if it's a conventional financing, I just include it for my buyers to review and sign. I don't necessarily make it part of the purchase agreement itself.
Got it.
If it's FHA or VA, you have to include it. Well, if it's FHA, you have to include the for-your protection, get a home inspection. If it's FHA or VA, you have to include the FVAC as well, but you check those boxes. When you check the box for the type of financing, it automatically incorporates those into your offer.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Claudia, did you have a question?
No, I just want to say thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Hopefully you guys found this valuable. We are back to forms training on Wednesdays at 11 o'clock, same link every Wednesday. If there's forms that you would like me to go over during this, please feel free to let me know so that I can incorporate them into the training. December's training schedule will look a little different, although I'll probably still do car forms at least for a couple weeks during December. And then we're getting ready to put together our new schedule for next year. We're almost at 2025. I can't believe we're at the end of the year. So if there's any trainings you'd like to see, let me know so I can get those on the calendar. Thanks, y'all, and we will see you tomorrow for Rev Up. We're talking about listing presentation. You are welcome, Iris.
Bye, Amy. Great class.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Have a great day.